first of all, the difference between a jazz musician and a normal musician. Good bit of info for you all to carry around. A normal musician like y'all plays 3 chords for about 300 people. A jazz musician plays 300 chords for usually about 3 people. It's the primary difference.
Love it.
Gotta laugh at it. But so that's a great segue into the first subject on my outline, which is playing jazzy as opposed to learning to play jazz tunes. I'm not teaching people how to play All of Me or Straight Note Chaser or Blue Monk or anything by Ornette Coleman today. We're teaching you how to take the concepts of jazz and apply them to such troglodyte material as Coming Around the Mountain and Foggy Mountain Breakdown. Now, for those of you out there who are my banjo students, don't be surprised. I also play musical instruments, okay? So I'll be juggling around from different materials as we try to demonstrate that these concepts apply to everything, even the miniature guitar, okay? Which we love. So, first of all, in items 1 and 2, if you look on your outline, you'll see that we're talking about there's 3 ways that we can approach jazz to jazz up regular songs, quote unquote. And when we're talking about syncopation, that would mean how to play your backup more bouncy. So I'm gonna beat up a common song called Coming Around the Mountain. And let's say we had the chords. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. Now, item 2A, syncopating those chords, would be something like this. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. So we're doing punches and rests and all sorts of bouncy rhythms to syncopate our backup. That applies to banjo, that applies to ukulele, applies to any time we're playing backup. Item B, this is what we're going to talk more about. How do we jazz up playing a melody? This is the fun part. Let's say you have, once again, a basic melody. I'm going to beat up that same old beautiful folk song, Coming Around the Mountain. If I were to use improvisation and jazz syncopation, that melody would sound something like this. And we're going to break down what I did there to take that straight quarter note melody and turn it into essentially a jazz melody, even though it's a folk song, okay? But before we do that, there's one more item under section 2. Jazz is all about using fancy, spicy chords. That's pretty much how it evolved, was the piano players started adding chords in between chords. That's my favorite explanation of jazz. All you're going to do is put stuff in between stuff, and you're playing jazz. So for the melody, if I go, here's jazz putting notes in between notes. I just literally put a note, 1 fret on either side of the melody note every now and then, and I had a jazz melody. So with the chords, if we go, she'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. There comes the D chord, right? She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. I put an A7 before the D, and after the D, I put a D7. I put passing chords in there. We're about to break that down. So, first of all, before we move on, I want to make sure you understand everything in this outline is going to be under item 2. Everything could be broke down in form of those 3 jazz tools. Those are huge. Syncopation, improvisation, and jazz chords. Those are the 3 areas we'll be studying to learn how to jazz up our playing of regular tunes. So, first of all, item 3, let's understand what it means to play syncopated. This is really cool. I do a lot of Celtic music, and in Celtic music, most of the tunes, especially the ones labeled hornpipes, are played very syncopated. So what happens is we basically make it as if there were more space in between every other note. Let me give you an example with straight notes in a line. That's played straight. Here is playing those same notes syncopated. Also called playing it swung, in swung time. It's also known as tied triplets because in music, if you have a triplet with a little 3 over it, and you tie the first 2 notes, instead of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, we will now have 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So what really is happening is there's so many ways to explain that, but the best way is to hear it and then mimic it, okay? So when you watch this next on YouTube, don't play along right yet because it'll get really noisy, but I want you to play along with the recording of this class along with what I'm about to demonstrate. You're going to take a D note on whatever instrument you're on, and you're going to experience playing this straight rhythm and switching over to it in syncopated swung rhythm. It's an exercise to go from straight to swung, back and forth. So I'm going to do that again. Once again, this example will be played along with on the YouTube version of the class. 1, 2, 3, 4, straight. Swung. Straight. Swung rhythm. Let me give an example. Some of my banjo students are learning a song called Blackberry Blossom. Now, that's usually played straight. Here it is played syncopated. It's kind of a hop, a bounce to it, okay? So in standard notation, let's take a quick look at that. In standard notation, what that's going to look like, here is what I just played first, which would be, let's make these nice 8th notes. I like those, are more attractive. So that looks like this. Now, when you normally see this rhythm syncopated as written on standard notation, here's what it looked like. It looks really funny. In fact, I had a friend describe jazz notation. It looks like if someone shot a bunch of watermelon seeds onto a blank piece of music paper. There's some truth to that because it starts to get really squirrely as soon as we start to add more timing differences. Another way you'll commonly see this written, and this is actually a good one to take a note of because you see this a lot in older music, is they'll do triplets. So in other words, if we had triplets and we tied the first 2 notes together, it would look like this. Now, as opposed to this, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And watch when I stop counting, this is the same as this. 2 ways to write in standard notation. When you see that, all you have to know is it means you're playing bouncy, so to speak. But that way you can have a screen share on the YouTube and copy that down. That's the 2 common ways you'll see that written in standard notation. Now, when you're playing jazz melodies or playing any melody, once again, I'm going to use that poor beat-up song we're just taking apart today, Coming Around the Mountain, to describe item 3B, delayed attack and anticipation. These are the 2 primary ways we use to syncopate our melodies when we're playing jazzified folk or bluegrass songs. So here's the start normally. Delayed attack simply means we hold off on the first couple notes and we come in a bit late on purpose and then often tie in the note to sound like we're back in time. So here's the count off normally. 1, 2, 3. Here's how I would start that with a delayed attack. 1, 2, 3. So I waited a little too long and then I caught up. 1, 2, 3. I'll do it again. Here. I'm hitting target notes too quick and then waiting until I'm back in time. Delayed attack. Anticipation means just the opposite. We hit a melody note too soon on purpose and then tie it over to get back in time. Here's anticipation starting with that same song. 1, 2, 3. So I started my pickup notes right before the beat. Here's more examples. 2, 3. See? There we go. 2, 3. I'm hitting the next note too soon on purpose and then waiting till I'm back in time. So there's two ways to stretch time. You can wait a bit and then come into the melody note, or you can hit it too soon and then wait till you're back in time. Those are often misunderstood, and those phrases are obviously scary sounding: delayed, attack, and anticipation. But all it means is you're stretching the timing of the melody either by waiting or rushing. Those are two very common phrases you'll hear when discussing jazz syncopation. Now, let me give you an example of a common bluegrass run. It's called the Leicester Flat G run. You hear it a lot on guitar, right? At the end of a song. Coming round the mountain when she comes. Watch how I anticipate the last note now. Coming round the mountain when she comes. So I took out the note right before the last note and I hit it too fast on purpose. As opposed to this, I did this. You can feel that. You can feel that. Now, let's do the same thing with delayed attack. I'm going to miss the beginning of that run. Coming round the mountain when she comes. So I let a few quick beats go by and then played the phrase. So the point of that is whatever bluegrass lick or country lick or rock and roll lick you're doing on whatever instrument, this principle works. The classic Scruggs fill on the banjo. Check out what happens when I anticipate that last note. I literally just hit it where the note before it was. And then you wait. That's a classic example of anticipation. Okay? So now, delayed attack. I waited and then hit the note. So we now have just covered item B, and now we're going to go to item 3B double I. I know this sounds complicated, but that's what Word made me do. So what this is examples in scatting. This is when you try to sing or verbalize phrases to describe jazz syncopation. You all have heard the phrase bebop. If you research the history of that term, what's really fascinating is that word comes from people trying to describe how jazz musicians improvise melody lines. Very not straight in a row. Very much watermelon seeds scattered on the music paper. All over the place, unpredictable, and wonderfully wild. So, let me mimic some jazzy kind of improvising. Imagine a groove that's like... Unfortunately, I don't have the technology yet to have two of me, one of them a hologram, backing my own self up. I will soon. That's terrifying. But in the meantime, what we want to do is have you imagine that. And then, here's me playing sort of bebop phrases. 2, 3, 4. So right away, when you hear someone playing jazzy phrases, you hear two things jump at you. First of all, notice how I would rest and then start. Watch this. Rest. Rest. And I'd always play one note too long. That's anticipating the next phrase. So some point back there, some guy was trying to describe to a friend why he liked to go listen to Charlie Parker improvise. And he's like, well, he plays so wild and crazy. What do you mean? How does he play wild and crazy? Well, he seems to go, bebop, and bebop became a phrase to describe that sort of syncopated rhythm. It's really kind of school. Now, doo-wop would be the same too. In the classic, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing, a classic jazz song. I don't sing jazz, by the way. that was, if you listen to, and by the way, YouTube this is part of your homework, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Classic jazz song of all time. And listen to when they do that phrase, doo-wop, 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 or bebop. Some people say bebop. Listen to how those phrases are emulating everything we're talking about. It's really, really cool. So how do we approach that? Well, the way to start it is item C under 3, which is the idea of 3/4. You probably heard this phrase. What this means is, if you've got, and here's a great exercise, and this will fry your brain. If you have a tambourine or some noisemaker, don't do it now, but soon, what you want to do is hit the tambourine, and I will adjust this foot tambourine I have, which has alienated many a roommate, but it's a great device. So, and we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 on the floor. Now, if I was to play 3s over that, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, we would get this. Many hours practicing to be able to do that. Try it sometime. It's actually really great exercise. Can you clap in 3 and tap in 4? 3/4. That rhythm, so you jazz musicians will take right to this. That rhythm is called, in folk culture, the hand jive. It goes way back to Bo Diddley and a lot of African-American influences into early rock and roll were because African drumming is always in 3s, and a lot of our bass over here is in 4s. When those two cultures collided, we began to have these amazing syncopations in early rock and roll, which were named 3/4. Really, really cool stuff. So now how do we approach that on the banjo? Well, guess what? That's built in. Most bluegrass songs are in 2/4 and 4/4 time. How many fingers are we playing with? 3. We have automatic syncopation built in for you banjo players. So if you have a basic beat and you're playing any 3-note roll, let's take a basic forward roll, watch the magic that happens. Let me break that down. First of all, we started with the 5th. The next one's going to start with the 3rd string. And the last roll started on the 1st string. That's because we're playing 3 notes in a row over and over a 4/4 beat. So that's what gives us that automatic syncopation where we're playing banjo. Let's say I'm playing backwards rolls. We have that delightful bounce just by the nature of the instrument. How can we duplicate that on other instruments? By thinking in groups of 3 over songs that aren't waltzes or jigs. So let's say we have Coming Around the Mountain Again. We're just going to beat this song up today. Okay. I'm going to play in, what's it challenging? I'm going to play in this rhythm, the 3/4, and try to adapt that to my melody. Oh my gosh, what did I just get myself into? Can you hear that? I'm going 1, 2, 3. I'm doing rhythms of 3 with the melody of Coming Around the Mountain over the 4/4 beat on the tambourine, and that literally just split my brain in half, and I must sip my coffee now. This stuff's difficult. Okay, so here's the funny part about talking about jazz. As most of you who looked at my outline probably realized, this is terrifying. It looks like a quantum physics paper, because when you're describing the natural desire to syncopate and create, and you try to put it in words and the largely square terminology of modern Western music theory, we get lots of weird syntax, because it's easier to play jazzy than to describe how to play jazzy. That's the irony here. When I was first learning jazz on my banjo, when you look at the sheet music for songs like, you know, Straight Note Chaser or Donna Lee or any of those bebop, hard bop songs, they are so full of ties and dotted notes and implied triplets and all these crazy rhythms that the heads, as they call them on the page, are way more difficult to learn than just listening to someone play it on YouTube and copying it by ear. So it's actually easier to do a lot of this stuff when you're playing along with it. Now, unfortunately, due to the nature of a group Zoom, if we did that now, it would be totally pandemonium. But later on, you will do that along with the YouTube video, okay? So let's move on to item 4, melodic improvisation. Now, what this really just means is improvising with melodies, taking a melody and changing it up. How do we make it sound more jazzy? I love this first item A, using questionable notes. As I often tell my beginners, when you're learning a song and you make a mistake, simply immediately repeat that mistake and inform people that you're a jazz musician. Now, the other side of that joke is we try to find notes that are off color. Guess what? Write this one down. Try putting a note on either side of a melody note. It's that simple. What this means for fretted instruments is 1 fret lower or 1 fret higher. What it means for fiddlers is buy a mandolin. I sell them. So in this case, we're going to go back one more time to the tired and over-punished song Coming Around the Mountain. What about right before we land on that G at the end, we put a F sharp. That's jazz at its primordial level. We put a passing tone in there. What if we get really jiggy and put it on top? It might be too weird, but it might work. Get away with that. I mean, it's questionable, but it's kind of cool. Now, what if before I hit that last G note, I'm going to go under it, over it, and then back to it. Same thing here. It's a little primitive, but you can start improvising with jazz feel over any melody, including Happy Birthday, by putting notes 1 fret below and 1 fret above, or vice versa, and then landing on your target tone. Okay? So this is how we think when we're playing our scales and we're trying to sound jazzy. If I'm playing a G Mixolydian scale, I'm just messing around with the scale. Now watch this. I'm going to go down to the F note. I'm going to go, there we go. So here's my E note. I'm going to go up and under and hit it. Ooh, that's cool. And then we start having more expression because we can dance around a melody note, not just smack it, okay? Questionable notes, I couldn't think of a better term. B, chromatic passing tones. Same thing, except this implies we're using the chromatic scale. Very annoying, but very cool, where we play every note, all sharps and flats together. Now, so with chromatic passing tones, we're going to use a bunch of fret by fret notes leading up to our target. So once again, there's that sad, sorry song. I'm going to chromatically lead all the way up to the last note. Here we go. Using the chromatic scale. Guess what? There's no wrong notes in the chromatic scale because they're all wrong. So you're committed at that point. Awesome. Now, flourishes. There's a lot of things people do where it's almost kind of questionable to, it's hard to play and describe them. So the best way is to say they generally fall into left hand joining the fray. So most of you have heard of slides, hammer-ons, and pull-offs. If you have any questions about this, ask me at our next private lesson, and I'll detail and make you a video of it. But basically, sliding into a note, pulling off to a note, hammering on to a note. Now, with wind instruments, it's not quite the same. I'm sure I don't play wind, and I wish that I did, but I already play too many instruments badly, and I think it's time to stop. The idea is you probably have the same ways to ornament that with fingering technique. I'm going to describe it for a fretted instrument. So slid in. Okay, now I'm going to pull off. Same thing with the banjo. Now, we're not so much talking about the role playing and the Scruggs technique when I bring up banjo, just so you all know. We're talking about single string and melodic style, so we're playing it more like a normal instrument. and so real super quick lecture for those of you here who are civilians and don't play the banjo. A lot of us play a style called Scruggs style where we do fast, rapid patterns, and we learn how to sneak the melody in there. That's how a Scruggs player would mimic that melody. Now we're talking as a melodic instrument, so here we go. Slide, pull off, hammer, slide, hammer, pull off. So the left hand flourishes, I call them LHO or left hand ornaments, are very handy when you have a plain melody. Now, arpeggios. This is one of my favorites. Think of it this way. Notes mostly go like ants on a log. Arpeggios are big zigzags. We have much higher leaps because we're playing the notes of a chord in succession, not all together. So here, if we have a G chord, here's it played harmonically or as a chord. If we pick the notes separately, we essentially have an arpeggio, which explains once again why Scruggs style is just arpeggios over and over again. So let's say we are adding arpeggios to Coming Around the Mountain. Well, this song will never be the same. Now, at the end there, I'm going to add an arpeggio that matches that chord. Okay, so I'm going to play the notes of the chord separately. Same here. Here comes the 5 chord. I'm adding chord tones played separately as ornaments, okay? New scales. Let's talk about when people say, well, I want to sound jazzy. What's a jazz scale? That's an impossible question to answer, but I will tell you that the idea behind most jazz scales is that they're based around the sound of the blues, and to sound like you're playing blues, we add what's called the flat 7. This is a bit of theory we've talked about. That means if you're playing a major scale, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We take that 7th note and we flat it by moving it down a fret. And we have what's known as the Mixolydian scale, which is actually a mode, but we'll tell you about that when you're older. So now here's why that works. Because if we're playing a 7th chord, what makes it sound 7th and jazzy and cool and slightly depressed and I'm ready to go drink Mad Dog under a bridge somewhere is that it has that note in there, which is an anxious tone. The regular sharp 7 is too happy. Joy to the world. It's too happy. So when you flat that, we have that bluesy flavor. So of course, the 7 is the bread and butter of blues and jazz. That's with chords. You turn it over to scales and you get this wonderful scale called the Mixolydian. Think of it as the equivalent of the 7th chord or the dominant 7th chord in scale form. So remind me at your personal lessons to make sure you all know how to make a Mixolydian scale. The formula is take a major scale and flat the 7. Those of you who are into modal voodoo with me know that we also play out of the 4th as far as displacement keys, but I'm not going to touch that right now. So then we did, it's still not jazzy enough. So let's say we're playing along in our G Mixolydian and we're playing the 9-pound hammer and we want to sound jazzy and we're at a fairly safe jam because there's not that many cowboy hats there and we can get experimental. Then we have 9-pound hammer. No. Here's my scale I'm going to play. It's flat 7, Mixolydian. I'm playing my Mixolydian G scale. Still not jazzy enough. Guess what jazz people start doing? They do what's called the altered Mixolydian. They'll start changing other notes. Write this down. Here's how we alter the Mixolydian. First of all, we add the flat fifth. El Diabolus in Musica, the devil's note. Some of you have heard my little lecture on the history of that note. Pretty spooky. If you take an octave from D to D or any note, and you cut the octave exactly in half, you have that flat 5. So in G, we have G, octave of G, the octave exactly in half. Creepy, creepy note. If you were just to play the flat 5 in the root, guess what you get? The most disturbing interval in Western culture. That's why it's used for car alarms and other unnecessary things. Now, used in conjunction with a note on either side, it's now jazzy and bluesy. So here's our G Mixolydian. Now we're going to add that flat 5. Check out what happened. We have more flavor now. We have a new note to play with, okay? Some people add the flat second to get really exotic. The second note of the scale, 1, 2, when we're rising up, if you flat it, all of a sudden it gives it a gypsy kind of Middle Eastern sound. Now we have more flavor. Anytime you're flatting those notes in the Mixolydian, it's called the altered Mixolydian. After that, we have pentatonic and blues scales. Not so much jazzy, but it's nice to be able to get vanilla now and then and let it breathe and play a little softer. So let's say you're making a pentatonic scale. Once again, watch the YouTube video. If this goes by too fast, you take a major scale, you take out the 4 and the 7, you get a real friendly sounding scale. It's real happy and up. Can work for jazz sometimes. Eventually it gets a little bit monotonous, okay? But that is a scale people use. Now, let's talk about atonal scales, the last item on page 1. This means we're now moving to an area which doesn't have a tonality. You can think of it as not having a key. It commits to no key. It can be used in all sorts of situations that are leading you to a tonal area. So, chromatic, every single fret you have. So all you're going to do is play a scale from one octave to another octave and cover every fret. You can do this on one string to practice. That was my chromatic scale on the ukulele. I went every fret up and every fret down. These are, I think of them as like as cayenne in cooking. Sprinkle little bits of that in when you're improvising, and it allows you to kind of break away from the tonality and then come back. So if I'm going, those are all chromatic scales where I'm going every single note. The whole tone scale is wild. Some of you have had a little bit of music theory, and maybe you had a piano teacher wearing horn-rimmed glasses and waving a ruler around. My condolences. But she probably got you to remember that scales are built on a series of whole tones and half tones. Whole tone, half tone, whole tone, half tone was the mantra. So if we take that and say, what if I just did every single step a whole tone? We get a new beast. It's called a whole tone scale. And you can do it on the banjo by moving 2 frets infinitely. Watch this. Ooh, it's got 6 notes. You can work it out melodically. We have a whole tone scale. That's fun if you want to go to an area where you're kind of swimming around and not committing to the key for a minute, which is part of jazz, is leaving the tonality and then coming back. Finally, the diminished scale. This is where we go whole tone, half tone, whole tone, half tone, whole tone, half tone, whole tone, half tone, indefinitely. So whole tone, or 2 frets, 1 fret, 2 frets, 1 fret, 2 frets, 1 fret, 2 frets, 1 fret. You've just built a diminished scale. Reverse that and it's called half diminished, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, now This stuff's scary, I know. But remember, you can use this in bluegrass, folk, rock, and country music because you're jazzing up other material. We're not trying to learn jazz standards here. Okay, go to page 2. Playing the changes. This means that we're following the chord progression. Let's say we have G, E minor, A7, D7, called a 1-6-2-5, classic jazz progression, okay? Jazz musicians like to be able to play scales or arpeggios that match each one of those chords. Most of you know in our music, we use one scale and we try to find tones out of that scale that fit each chord. Jazz plays a different thing for each chord. So here's my G, my E minor, my A, my D7, here's G, G scale, E, E7, A7, G. I'm playing a different technique that matches. I played a G scale for the G chord, an E7 arpeggio for the E chord, an A7 scale for the A chord, and a D9 arpeggio for the D chord. That takes a lot of brain power. Playing the changes is one of the last techniques we learn because you have to have a giant toolbox. What's funner, ironically, is playing outside in item G. Jazz musicians often like to avoid the triad. If we're playing in G, our basic triad is G, B, and D, right? That makes the G chord. What if we only played the 7th note? And what if we went further and said, well, what if I played the 7th and then missed the G, because I don't want to play that, went up to the A, it's called a 9th in jazz because it's the 2nd plus an octave. Ooh, what if I then also went up to the next non-chord tone, which would be a C? I have F, A, and C over your G. You're doing this, I'm doing this. I'm staying above the triad by playing non-chord tones. You'll hear all the great saxophonists doing that. You listen to Charlie Parker, you slow down that stuff and analyze the chord tones. He's avoiding triads. He's playing 7s, 9s, 11s, flat 5s, and flat 13s, staying above the tonality. Let's talk about jazz chords. So, the primordial jazz chord is the dominant 7th. What does dominant mean? It's from an old world, outmoded nomenclature for the scale tones that went tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, I think it was submediant, and then leading tone. Old school theory. But the dominant was what they called the 5th tone of the scale. So if you harmonize a scale, I'm going to go to G, it'll go G, A minor, B minor, C, D, E minor, F, half diminished, F sharp half diminished, G. Now watch what happens when I harmonize the G scale in 7ths. G major 7, A minor 7, B minor 7, C major 7. On the D, on that 5th note, the 7th that occurs has a flatted 7th in there. It's the dominant 7. That's the 7th we all hear in rock and roll and blues, okay? So when anyone says, hey, this song starts in G7, they don't know this, but they mean G dominant 7 with the flatted 7th note. There's other 7s out there. There's the major 7 where we have a sharp 7. There's the minor 7 where we have a minor triad with the flat 7. There's all different flavors of the 7th chord. But the dominant 7th is the main sound that we're working with. Now, the purpose of the dominant 7th is to move up a 4th. Anytime you hear a G7, guess where that's probably going to want to go? To a C. Anytime you hear a D7, guess where that's probably want to go? Up 4 tones, which is a G. Okay? So what that means is now we get to use our jazz chords in regular music. Here's how we do that. First of all, we're going to briefly talk about when we make a jazz chord. How do you make a jazz chord? Item B, letter I under B is an alteration. You take your chord and you mess with the notes. Let's take the 5th and move it down 1. Hey, that's a flat 5. I just made a G flat 5. I sound like a jazz guy. I'm talking the nomenclature. All I did was alter one of the notes. What if I take that G chord and raise the 5th? That's a G sharp 5 or a G augmented. So altering the notes of the chord is the first way. The next way is adding new notes to the chord. Look at our 7th. We added that flat 7. That's why that's the very first jazz chord that happens. What if we add the 9th of the scale? We have a G9. What if we add the 11th of the scale? We have a G11. So adding notes or changing notes. There's only 2 ways in this 2-dimensional universe we can change a chord. We change one of the notes, or we add a new note. That's called alterations and extensions. Now, on most instruments, since we don't have a piano, when we start adding notes, we have to do chord editing. What if you have a G13, which would be 1, 3, 5, flat 7, 9, 11, 13? It would have, you know, a ton of notes in there. What is that? 7 notes? 5 notes? My math sucks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 notes. A heptad. So how do we play that on banjo? You do chord editing. First to go is the root, because someone's playing the root. We need the 3rd to tell if it's major or minor. And we need to keep the highest extension, because that's what's going to be called. So you could actually make a G13 by just having the E note, the B note, and the D note. Oh, it sounds like a jazz horn section. It's cool. A common one on banjo is the 7th, the 3rd, and the 13th. Another great jazz chord. I love using that. Great jazz terminology comes out of that. Now, let's talk about the must-have jazz chords in item D. Here's the ones you're going to learn from your jazz chord charts. You got to have these. The 6th, the minor 7, the major 7, the 9th, and the diminished. There's 5 ones that we use all the time. That's kind of a forewarning for those of you taking private lessons with me, that those 5 chords are going to start to sneak into our lesson. So start to keep them somewhere on your refrigerator, because they're going to rear their ugly head. How do we use them? Item E, under 5. Passing chords or substitute chords. If you look at 1 under 5 and 3 under 5, Roman, you'll see it's passing chords and substitute chords. Once again, we're back to 3-dimensional reality here. There's only things in a row and things stacked up. Only 2 ways we can use a jazz chord in Coming Around the Mountain. We can put it between the existing chords, or we can replace one of the existing chords. Let's talk about that. Here's the chords to Coming Around the Mountain. I'm going to put the banjo down and grab up a musical instrument for a minute. So here we go with a G. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. The D's coming up, right? Coming around the mountain when she comes. So I'm going to put in a passing chord that's going to go to D. What do I want to use for that? The secondary dominant. That's item 1. That means I'm going to find the 5 of the chord I'm moving to. That pulls up a 4th, remember? So I'm going to go G, and I know a D chord's coming. I'm going to sneak an A7 in there, because A7 wants to go to D. That's my passing chord. Watch this. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. Speed up. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. Ooh, that sounded really cool. It went G, A7 to D. Okay? That's a passing chord. Here's what you can use for putting in between chords. Items 1, 2, and 3 under E1. Secondary dominant, the chord that's the 5 of the chord you're going to. Chromatic resolution, putting a chord 1 fret lower or higher than the chord you're going to. That's easy. And 3, diminished, augmented, or altered dominants, meaning those really weird chords that sound dissonant, like the diminished and augmented chords, work great for pulling to a new chord. That's passing chords. The watercolor metaphor. Think of it like this. Rock and roll and country likes to go red, blue, basic colors, peacock paint set. Jazz likes to go red, dark red, purplish, and then blue. So there's like a watercolor wash between the chord changes. It's smooth. Jazz is smooth. It's been smoothed out. Now, item 3 under E, using substitute chords. How about when I get to that D chord, I just want to play something else in spite of it. I don't want to do fancy chords leading up to it. When I come around the mountain when she comes, when I hit that D, you can also do a D7. Imagine that. That's your basic chord substitution. Also, you can do what's called the next step up. This means when there's a 7th chord, you do a 9th. When there's a 9th chord, you do an 11th. When there's 11th, you do a 13th. You're building up on the extensions. So this requires knowing some jazz chord positions, but that's the first substitution. People go the next step up in chord extensions. So let's talk about for major chords. For example, item 2 under 3E. If I'm playing a G, you can play a G6. That's a great chord on the banjo, by the way. And it sounds like a sunny walk through a delightful meadow. It's just really cool how 6 give you a happy flavor. There's a G chord. There's a G6. So now I can play that over the G. Watch, she'll be coming. It sounds like jazz now. So I can do a major 7. This is really kind of making it into mall music now, and I probably wouldn't do this, but if I wanted to, ooh. This is like the Kenny G version of Coming Around the Mountain now. Coming around the mountain. I can't even do that, but legally it's possible. Now, common tone substitution. Item 3 under 3E is what some of you have heard me talk about, the minor 5 and the flat 7, major 7. What this means, and this is some of the most heady stuff in this whole workshop, so please keep your hat on, is that if you have, I'm going to put it in G because that's the people's key. If someone's playing a G7, you can do what's called a minor 5 sub. You move 5 scale tones up and play a minor chord, and that will match the G7. Let's analyze that. I'm playing G7. You go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's a D note. I'm going to play a D minor. So you play a D minor chord over my G7. Watch how they sound similar. Really, really cool. And it's creating the resultant of a G9. Okay? Now, this is even more sophisticated. Let's say I'm playing that same G7. You play what's called the flat 7, major 7. Substitute. So you're going to go find the flat 7 of my G key, which is F, and you're going to play a major 7 chord. I'm playing an F major 7 position over your G. The resultant is a G13. It's really, really hip. So here's the G7 that you'll be playing. I'm going to play a D minor everywhere I want. Now I'm going to play an F major 7. Super jazzy sounding. Now I'm hovering around in the outer extensions of the chord, and I don't have time to break this down, but one day we'll talk about using that for soloing. Check out. I could use those extended arpeggios in my soloing as well. That's how we substitute chords. Okay. Now, item F, using jazz chords for leads. Let's say you learn these 5 chords I want you to learn. The 6, the minor 7, the major 7, the 9th, and the diminished. Sure, it's great to play them by strumming along with people, but how do you use them for soloing? You arpeggiate them. You break them up into the single tones. So in banjo, it's kind of easy because we make the chord form and we do some kind of a roll. Let's say we're going to do that on the ukulele. Let's say you had a something sassy. So what's a cool sassy one? A C9. If I'm soloing with that, here's my C scale. Sorry, C Mixolydian. All of a sudden, check out. I played notes of the 9th chord in with my Mixolydian scale. I'm moving from scales to arpeggios to scales. I'm moving from linear to angular, keeping my playing interesting, okay? So let's do a review of that, and now we have some time for questions. By the way, that was challenging to get all that material out in an hour. I scared myself there. I'm gonna start making my outlines smaller. But there's so much to discuss with jazz, and that everything we just talked about is scratching the surface. It's the tip of the iceberg, the tip of the jazzberg, if you will. So we're applying all of this to songs we'll be working on in our lessons. How do you apply it to Blackberry Blossom? How do you apply it to Coming Around the Mountain? How do you apply it to Wagon Wheel? Because that song had it coming. How do we change up these songs so we can add stuff to it? Who said Wagon Wheel? There's a great t-shirt out I want. It says Wagon Wheel on it, and that has a circle with a red slash over it. Don't even have to say anything. I know, everybody rips on Wagon Wheel. It's unfortunate. So check it out. If we're playing Blackberry Blossom, we go to the second part, which goes to E minor. The first element of thinking like jazz is to say, well, I don't want to play that melody. I'm going to pick an E minor Mixolydian scale. I'm going to improvise. Over basically what is E minor and E Mixolydian scales. I can pick an E blues scale and play that over the E minor section. You can apply this to anything. You can apply it to, let's do Wagon Wheel. I'm sorry ahead of time. It goes G to the D, E minor to the C. I'm going to use substitute chord, G6, D7, E minor 9, C major 7. That's how I can get revenge. No, because that makes it interesting what is normally just a standard 1-5-6-4, which is anything Jason Mraz ever wrote for his entire career. So you can see how you can take pop music and start adding substitute chords, passing chords, and you're never bored while you're playing it. Okay, I'm going to breathe in, and why don't we see if anyone has some short and interesting questions. Go ahead and raise your hand so I know who's talking. If you have no questions, that's very concerning to me. That means you know everything. Yes, Mr. John Sims, I figured you'd ask a question. Are you muted?
Can you hear us?
No, you're not. Yes, now I can. Thanks for muting in the meantime. I appreciate that.
Now that you've blown our mind with this, so how do we peel this onion? What's the best way to start practicing it? Is it learning the different?
Go back to item 1, jazzing up simple songs. Okay, so using simple songs as the foundation. In our case, we're going to probably do Blackberry Blossom. So you want to think of there's only 2 things going on. I'm playing chords, I'm playing backup, and then I'm playing a lead, right? Both of those areas need to be jazzed up. So when let's say we're playing Will the Circle Be Unbroken. I'm going to get real brain dead bluegrass here for a minute. Will the circle be unbroken when by? You're playing backup most of the time right there. So guess what you're going to do? Substitute chords, passing chords. Substitute with a G6. Will the circle be unbroken? G7. By and by, Lord. I'm going to do a G minor substitute. Lord, by and by. Back to a D minor substitute. There's a better substitute E minor waiting. Secondary dominant in the sky, Lord. C in the sky. That's me playing the chords using passing and substitute jazz stuff. Now it gets to your lead. Sky's the limit. First of all, learn your darn Mixolydian scales, people. Know how to play a G scale with that F natural in there. Make sure you have your Mixolydian scales, and then you use that to noodle using the 3 R's or 4 R's. Those of you who work with me in private know what that means. How to take your scale and randomize it, do repetitions, do different rhythms, and do repeats and riffs so you can start making music with it. So to summarize your question, John, how do we start to peel this onion? Cut the onion in half. Think of 1/2 as lead, 1/2 as backup. Apply the simplest of jazz technologies to each of those halves separately as 2 different entities. Very good question. Any other questions, people? If you don't have questions, then I will just berate you at our next private lesson. This workshop will be uploaded to YouTube as soon as I make another gallon of coffee and go into video editing, probably in a week or so. And Those of you who have friends that play banjo or mandolin or guitar or ukulele and want to be able to jam with people and not get so traumatized, have them Google JamAlong. Still looking for students because apparently I scare some people away with my mean jazz theory. But y'all hung in there. This is really impressive. I know this is a lot. There's no way anyone can humanly or legally explain jazz in an hour. That's an insane proposition. But along with the outline and along with your lessons with me and along with watching this again on YouTube, the stuff's going to start to soak in. And remember, we're not trying to become a jazz musician. We're learning how to play jazzy on the music that we already play. Find out about upcoming workshops. Click on the events page at jamalong.org and you will see all of our upcoming classes.